All right, so we are back with another Quiltmas in July video. This time we are bringing you a replay of a video that we did last year on Quilt-As-You-Go Tree Skirts. We did one tree skirt video a couple years ago that was super intense, used a strip roll. It was gorgeous. I love it. It's what goes under my tree. But if you want something that's simpler and you can get done in an afternoon, the Quilt-As-You-Go Tree Skirt is for you. Now we have 4 kits that you can get available right now that you can see that we've made up so you know what they look like. You also can make your own. And so we've got the supply list that you need listed in the video description down below and on the batting section where you can buy the Quilt-As-You-Go batting as well. So you can get either or. You can come up with your own design. You can use some of our new holiday fabrics that we have here in stock at Quilt Addicts Anonymous. Or if you have a design, like maybe you have some leftovers from a quilt you did, you can absolutely use that for this. So I love this. It's so fun. It goes so fast. And it is a smaller tree skirt, but it's perfect if like you're in an apartment and you just need something a little bit smaller to go around that. If you're looking for something bigger, make sure you check out our strip roll tree skirt. That one is gorgeous and it definitely is a lot bigger in it. It's just, that's the one I have under my tree. It's so fun. But anyway, Quilt-As-You-Go Tree Skirt. I do not have any of the samples to share with you because we actually made them last year. And one of the perks of being a Quilt Addicts Anonymous team member is at our holiday party, we kind of have like a white elephant that you actually want where we go round robin and divvy up all the samples that we made throughout the year. So these all were under our team's Christmas trees last year. They all got to take them home and have some fun with them. But we will share with you some of that original footage so that way you can see what you're getting up close, because I know sometimes it's better to see it in a video than on a picture. So let's check it out and then let's get into this really fun, really fast tutorial. You definitely can get this one done by the holidays. You can get it done the same weekend it arrives at your doorstep. So it is so fun. So check it out. All right, let's take a peek at some of the ones that we did already, and then we're going to make a new version with the fabrics you see behind me, which is Peppermint from Figo. We have a red and green option also from Holiday Classics for Rifle Paper Company. And this one is so cute. It's got partridges in a pear tree. It's got the holly leaves. It, of course, has the metallic, and it just is really a really pretty collection. This one definitely gives you the more classic Christmassy feel. And then we've got a nice metallic with red with gold metallic going around for that binding. This one is a more modern look. This is from Free Spirit. It's called Fa La La. And we have some cute little Christmas trees and a couple of different colorways with reindeer and Santa ornaments. We have some lovely little stars going through, of course, a bunch of presents, and then your traditional snowflake as well. But it's just a nice, fun, modern colorway. So this would be great for gifting for any young person who maybe needs their first tree skirt. This one is also super fun, super modern. This one is called Mary and Maud. It's from Wyndham Fabrics. And it is really fun. We have some very bright limey greens along with some red and even a little pink with those poinsettia leaves. And then we have very like black and white contrast in it as well. So this one is really fun. It's definitely a little bit out there. It's not your traditional Christmas, but it looks great. We have all the numbers counting down to Christmas, and we've got some buffalo checks, and it really is just very, very pretty, very fun. This one is one of my faves. We are going to be working with Peppermint, which is the fabric you see behind me. That is a very modern collection from Figo, which is a modern division of Northcott Fabrics. When you get a kit from us, it is going to come with your batting. So this is a nice Quilt-As-You-Go batting. You're going to see that it has these blue lines on it, and that is your placement lines, which you'll see in just a second. You're going to get your template so that you know how to cut your fabrics. And then it also comes with a pattern, which gives you lots of ideas because you can do a lot more than just have the plain strips like we're going to do today. You could strip piece it. You could make this as fancy as you want, but this is what we're going to do today. We're just going to do it nice and easy. And since it's Quilt-As-You-Go, once you get the top piece, you've also quilted it. So you don't have to do anything more to it except trim it down and add binding, which is what makes it a nice fast project. The tree skirt finishes, by the way, to a 40-inch diameter, so it's a great size for just a moderate tree, and also you only need one with a backing fabric, and that also comes in the kit. We're going to send you some nice white backing fabric because it's facing the floor, nobody's going to see it, and white goes with everything. All right, so I've got my template, and there's a couple different ways you can cut it. You can lay it so that it is going across the length of the fabric, or you can lay it across the width of the fabric. It really doesn't matter which you choose, but you do want to pay attention to the direction of the fabric. I've got an extra one here where you can see that obviously this is not going to work because we do not want our trees going down, because this is going to be the outside of your tree skirt on the bottom. So your trees are going to look like they're upside down. So sometimes you might have some extra that you're not able to use, but that's okay, because you know what? We have one of our tutorials is for Ghosts of Christmas Past, which is a pattern that uses up all your Christmas scraps, and it doesn't matter if all the reds match all the reds or all the greens match all the greens. So we're going to be bringing that to you next, so save these. You can use them later. I'm going to go ahead and cut mine this way. I'll be able to get more that way. What I'm going to do is just lay that out, and then I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to place it along the edge of my template, just so that I've got a nice straight edge that I'm used to cutting on. Just going to go ahead and work my way around. All right, we've got one down. Since this isn't a directional fabric, I can go ahead and just turn my template around, and I can go ahead and cut another one. And that's all I'm going to cut for this one. I think that's going to be enough for what I'm doing, so then I can save my extra for another project. All right, now it's time to layer and baste our backing and our batting. I've got my center line. You can probably see the crease on the camera, and with the wrong side up. There really isn't a wrong side with white, but you might be using a print, and if that's the case, then you want to make sure you've got that. Then if you wanted to use a basting spray, you could. They recommend that you do, because June Tailor also makes a basting spray, so they want to sell you that as well. I'm just going to use safety pins because that's what I've got on hand. All right, so once you have it on top and laid nice and flat, you kind of just want to smooth from the center out. Sometimes it's also helpful to use painter's tape to tape your batting down, so that way it doesn't move when you're doing this step. And then you just want to check to make sure that your batting or your backing fabric is going beyond the lines that we're going to have. So we can see our printed lines here, and my backing fabric goes well beyond that, and I've checked the other side and that looks good too. So I'm just going to go ahead and put some safety pins within these lines, and I want to stay away from my seam line by quite a bit, because I'm going to be sewing all this with a walking foot, and that way I can keep it layered throughout the process and just remove it as I'm sewing. If you are working on your dining room table, when you do this, I recommend that you put your cutting mat underneath, because that way you will not be digging into your dining room table with your safety pins. That would not be a very good Christmas surprise. To start with, I'm just doing the areas that I can fit on the table. I'm doing about 2 safety pins per wedge, one at the top in the middle and one at the bottom. For these that are kind of hanging off of my desk, I can only do the top, but I am going to do as much as I can around the rest of it, and then I'll move everything as one piece to pin everything together later. All right, I I pinned as much as I can on the table. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to carefully slide it so I can see the rest of my tree skirt. And I'm also going to carefully smooth out. I'm trying to make sure that I don't feel any lumps or bumps where the backing fabric is bunched up, because you will see that once your tree skirt is all done. Now I'm going to go ahead and pin the outsides of the ones I missed and do the same thing on the other side. Now, if you want to make this a little bit easier to manage, you can cut on the outside of the tree skirt. Make sure you're leaving at least a 1-inch margin. I think I'm actually going to stitch mine together first, because we have to go along these basting stitches so we have a good line of where to trim later. All right, so both the inner and the outer circle have these dashed lines here. And what we want to do is we're going to take our walking foot on our machine and we're going to stitch just outside of that. Eventually, we're going to cut on this line to have our tree skirt be the correct size. But by stitching just on the outside, one, is going to give us that line to cut. And two, it's going to also keep everything in place for us, so that way things aren't moving about a ton. You're going to use your walking foot for pretty much everything on this quilt except creating your bias binding. The center one, you're definitely going to have to kind of smush your batting and backing together, and that's totally fine. It won't hurt it. You do a lot more finagling here because it's a lot tighter curve. Now, before I go any further, I want to do a little test run with my fabric to make sure I like the layout, because it's a lot easier to move it now than if you decide you don't like it once you've already sewn it in. Now, I should be able to use 2 for each space. So you're just going to lay it over top, and the lines that you see are your placement marks. They are not your sew marks. So I've got that in piece 1. So I'm just going to put my matching piece across from it, and we'll put that on piece 7. Let's see, I think I might give a little more space here so we can have some room in between. All right, I just kind of haphazardly laid things out here, and I think I want to switch things up a little bit. I think that these are too close together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch my darks. That way we have darks in multiple areas. I think we have a good mix of keeping these apart here, but these are too close. I don't want to have 2 reds next to each other because I have plenty here. I can certainly avoid that. So let's see, where's a better spot to put that? Let's just move these 2. I do have 3 of the same print next to each other, but I don't think there's too many ways around that, because if I switch these 2, then these are going to be really close together, and I'm not loving that option. Could switch these. Let's try that. All right, I think I'm happy with that. We don't have any more than 2 together in any one place, so that's good. And we have a good mix of color. We don't have a bunch of reds and pinks next to each other. We don't have too many teals. There's a lot of teal in this, so we do have some next to each other. But I think it's pretty well balanced at this point, so I'm happy with this layout. Now I'm going to find piece 1, which I think is this one. Yes, it is. Okay, so now I'm just going to lay this out in the order that it's going to be sewn. So I've got piece 1 and I put it on top of piece 2, and I'm just going to make my way around. That way I don't have to think too hard when I'm putting this together. I can just grab the next one in the stack. So as long as 1 is on top and 16 is on the bottom, and you got them in the correct order in between, you don't have to think anymore. You can just flip and sew. All right, so all of your wedges are numbered. So we have wedge 1 right here and wedge 2. So the first thing we're going to sew is between that. So if you've ever done stitch and flip or some sort of or paper piecing or quilt as you go, this is how it works. So for this one, we have our placement line. So we have a nice blue placement line here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to line the edges of that fabric up with that placement line, making sure that I'm hitting it at the top. That's the most important part. And your fabric, if you've cut it correctly, should fully fill that wedge and that placement line. Now we're going to put piece 2, eventually it's going to be right here, but we have to put it right sides together because we are sewing it just like we would a regular one. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to give this a pin, and I am not going to pin like right next to where I'm sewing because, or actually you could pin across like this. That would be fine, like you normally would. You'll just have to remove your pins as you go, just like you would in normal sewing. And you need to make sure that you know where your 1/4 inch is on your walking foot, because this is meant to be sewn with a 1/4 inch seam. And if you are sewing larger than a 1/4 inch seam, then your wedges are not going to line up with the next placement line. So it's important that you measure that, figure that out on your old sewing machine, so that way you can stitch a 1/4 inch stitch with your walking foot on your machine. All right, so now we're just going to stitch a 1/4 inch stitch straight down this edge. We're going to flip it over and work our way around. I'm going to go ahead and increase my stitch length to 3.5. Since we are technically quilting at the same time we are piecing, that's totally fine. And if no one's ever explained it to you before, a walking foot is pretty critical because it moves, it has feed dogs on the top that are paired and are moving at the same time as your feed dogs underneath. So what it does is it moves all of your layers together at the same rate so you don't get bunching on your fabric, which is incredibly important when you're quilting or sewing on binding. All right, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and remove my next 2 safety pins because I am not going to be able to remove them if I sew over first. I'm also going to do the same thing over here, so that way I don't mess this up either. I'm leaving all my other safety pins in place because I only want to remove them as I come to them because we need to keep this all basted together till we're ready to sew. All right, now if you unfold this, you press it over, you're going to be able to get your fabric pretty much, it's not exactly even with the next placement line. So we did in this case, it's looking pretty good, and they recommend that you do not press. And the reason why is you might shrink the batting and then it might shrink as you go around. So you don't want to press, so just use your hands, push it over as much as you can. The cotton fabric will want to stick to the cotton batting, so that makes your life a little easier. All right, I'm going to go ahead and grab my next piece, which is just right on top of my stack because we took the time to arrange that. And we're going to arrange it right sides together, also making sure that you're in line with that piecing line. Like this one, I'm in just a smidgen from the piecing line. So I'm going to go ahead and line the next piece up with that piecing line, even though it's not exactly in line with the edge of the fabric there. That way I can keep making up any mistakes as I go around. So I'm just going to keep doing this until I've made my way around to sew on piece 16. All right, so I'm having an issue here where my bottom fabric is kind of sliding over as I'm going, and it's causing me to end up losing some. I think the templates may also have been cut a little skinny, which is causing issue. But I've got about a little, maybe 3/8 of an inch between where the edge of my piece is and where the placement line is for the next one. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take my fabric, I'm going to bring it over as far as I can, just give it a good little tug there. I don't want it to get bunchy, but I do want it to, you know, be where it's not going to slide over on me. All right, now I'm going to take my next piece and I'm going to line it just a little bit beyond, not too much, maybe 1/8 of an inch. That way I can still sew my 1/4 inch and hit everything underneath. Do these pins next. And that way I can gain like 1/8 of an inch with each progressive round so that hopefully I end up where I want to be on the end. And if not, if I'm a little short, it's going to be in the back of the tree. No one's ever going to know. All right, so since I didn't line those edges up perfectly, you want to make sure to open this up as much as you can. Make sure you didn't miss anything, and I didn't. And I've gained a little bit of ground here. I've got more to gain, and hopefully I'll do that as I progressively move my way around. So I'm just going to keep doing that as I go, just lining it up a little bit different, doing the double pinning to sort of make up for this ground that I've lost here, and keep going around the rest. All right, so I'm about 2 hours into this project at this point, and I've got all my pieces on. Now, I did make up almost all of the ground that I lost and where the pieces got a little skinny, and then I lost it on one piece. So make sure you are paying really close attention when you're cutting your templates to make sure they're all the size that they're supposed to be, because it's really easy to lose ground. Now, I am going to be overlapping here. You can see that my fabric overlaps really well, so I'm not worried about it. If yours was really bad and really off, just cut an extra template and just sew it on. No one's gonna know. It's in the background. All that matters is that you end up with a circle in the end. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm just gonna pin these guys in place just temporarily, so that way we can trim down this tree skirt. And I just want to make sure that my edges are in place in the bottom and in the top, so that way these pieces kind of stay put when I am trimming. Let's get a couple more pins in down there and a couple more up here. Everything else is held down by threads, so we don't have to worry so much about that. All right, so now we're gonna flip this over. And this is why it was so important to sew that stitching line, because at this point we can't see the lines that we were lining everything up with anymore. So we have to use this as like our guide. And I'm gonna stitch right next to that stitching line. I wanna kind of keep it together because that'll keep everything nice and together for binding, but I also wanna make sure that I'm cutting around. All right, so I'm just trimming as close to that line as I can, maybe 1/16 of an inch away, and I'm just going to work my way around the entire perimeter, or circumference if we're going to be proper with our math. All right, so I've got my whole circle cut, so I'm going to go ahead and take my pins out now so I can cut up the slit that's going to go around your tree. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to open this up, and we're supposed to cut right on this dotted line here. But first I'm going to make sure, what I think I'm going to do, because mine didn't turn out perfectly center, is I'm just going to go ahead and cut right up the side of my piece here, because I can stitch along that and get that nice and secure in a minute. Okay, made it to my center. So I'm just going to pull that out of the way for a second. And now I'm going to flip this over. And I am just going to cut off my excess here. And that way I will have a perfect circle, even though I got off a little bit. So if you too get off a little bit, no reason to panic. You're gonna be okay. All right, now I'm also gonna cut around the inside of this. It's really important to cut right on, like right next to, as close as you can get to that circle of thread. If you are not on it, your binding doesn't lay flat when you go around the edge, and we learned that from experience. All right, we've got a nice flat circle that meets up. Even though we got a little off there, it still looks great. I'm gonna go ahead, just because I do have stitching going around all the edges here, I do wanna just do a little stay stitch along the edges here, just to make sure these stay in place when I do the binding. I'm just gonna throw a couple pins in along the edges, and then I'm gonna stitch just like 1/8 of an inch stitch down the edge. That way it'll get covered up when we install our binding later. If you want, you can actually do that around your entire quilt. I'm not gonna go all the way around because this has been secured all along here. Also, if you wanted to get fancier at this point with your quilting, now is the time to do it because you have got everything nice and secured and everything is cut apart nicely. But I would do that stay stitching before you got any fancier with your quilting. All right, about 2 hours so far to get to this point. Now we're gonna create some bias binding, get it around the edges, and then you're ready to sit down with some Netflix and hand stitch it down. So stripes like this make great bias binding because you end up seeing it on the diagonal. It's really cool. Now, I have done bias binding before. I know it sounds like a scary term. It is awkward, but it's not hard. And it really is cool because you end up with continuous bias binding with the method we're going to show you here. We have a tutorial that's just dedicated to that we did for our tree skirt last year. For this one, we need 1/2 yard of fabric, and the pattern will tell you need more, and you don't. It is just a little less awkward to put together. So we're going to make this with 1/2 yard, and we're going to get this sewn together. So the first thing I'm going to do is square up my 1/2 yard. So I'm lining my selvages up so that they're nice and even, and then I'm just going to square up that edge. I'm lining the inch line of my ruler up at the top, and then I'm just going to make sure I've got a nice straight edge on the right here. Then I'm just going to flip my entire mat around so I don't have to do a lot of movement on the fabric, and scooch it over, and I'm also going to square up the other edge. This time I'm lining up with the fold on the bottom, and I'm just scooching over as far as it'll go because I want to use as much fabric as possible, and we're going to cut. One last thing, we've got to square up our selvage edge here. So we're just going to line that up. We're going to come over as far as we can, make sure we're nice and square on the top and bottom. Cut that off. All right, now that we've got a nice rectangle that has nice square edges, we're going to unfold it, and I'm going to cut a right angle triangle out of this. So to do that, I'm going to use the 45-degree line that's on my ruler, and I'm just going to line it up with the bottom corner and just cut across. Now I'm not going to be able to make it all the way across, but I'll be able to make it most of the way, and then I can line my ruler up to go the rest of the way across. Can move it out of the way. Then you can flip it and line the 45-degree line up with the top and scooch it over until you're lined up over here, and then you know you still have a nice 45-degree angle going the rest of the way across your fabric. All right, now we're going to take this corner that we just cut out. We're going to come all the way over, and we see we have our nice straight edge there. We are going to pin it together. Now our corners should be in the opposite side, so we can see we have a point on this side on the top, and we're also have a point on the bottom. That's the way we want it to be. I'm gonna pin across the top here and sew that together with a 1/4 inch seam. I think I'm gonna go ahead and do that with my walking foot just because I'm being a little lazy and I do not wanna have to switch out that foot. All right, I've got my seam pressed open and we're ready to start marking this. All right, so we've got our weird looking shape with our points going in opposite directions. Now what we want, and this is the hardest part when you're trying to figure out which way to mark everything. So if we start marking this way, then we're not going to end up with bias binding because this is the width of the fabric. You can tell because it's not stretchy, and it's also going, the lines are going straight across, and we know that this is a stripe binding, so it's going to be going this way. So we want to go this way. See how much more stretch that has? So what you want to do is you want to start marking lines. This one didn't fall off the edge of it with me. And you want to start marking them. In this case, I'm going to do every 2.5 inches along the stretchy bias. And that's where you want to pay attention to. And one really good way to tell is when you put this on, if you're doing 2.5 inch strips, either from a fat quarter or a 1/2 yard like this, your ruler is not going to make it all the way across. If you're doing it from like a fat quarter, if you've got a smaller piece to work with, then your ruler would make it all the way across if you did it that way. But mostly what you're looking for is eventually we're going to be cutting off long strips. They have to be on a bias edge. So it needs to be the stretchy part that you are marking your lines on. Now while I love my friction gel pen for most things, when I'm doing bias binding, I like to use an actual pencil because that is not going to go away with heat, because it doesn't work so great on this fabric because it's going to be a little awkward because we're dealing with a very long skinny piece. But for other ones, when you are dealing with a bigger one, like say for an actual size quilt, you can actually press the seam before you cut everything apart. All right, so I marked my first 2.5 inch line. It's going to be really hard to see on the camera with this really dark background, but I'm going to put my 2.5 inch line of my ruler on that pencil line that I just drew, and I'm going to mark across, and I'm going to keep on doing that until I've made it all the way across my entire piece of fabric. I almost always end up with one skinny strip at the top. Don't worry about that. We're going to cut it off later. All right, so here is where it gets a little weird. We need to put these together and we are going to offset it. So what we're trying to do is find our first line. And this is where it's really awkward because we have a very skinny piece that we are working with. All right, so here is my first line on this side. So I'm going to find my second line on the other one. So here we have our line. So here's 1 and here is 2. And we want to match up our first line with our second line. And that way we kind of have an edge to go and we're able to have continuous binding all the way around when we cut this apart. If that doesn't make sense just yet, just keep watching, it will in a second. All right, so I'm putting my pin in right through where that line is, about a 1/4 inch away from the edge. And then I'm going to find a 1/4 inch away from the edge on my second line and just eyeball that. And then I'm going to match it so that my pieces are going even with the edges there. And I'm just going to pin that in place. And now from here on out, we're just going to match things as we go. So I'm going to go ahead and pin my first piece here. And this is where it gets super awkward because this is just really weird to work with. It's a very strange angle. So what we're going to do, and you can kind of see that this will work, because if we open it up like this, you can see that the lines are starting to go straight across. It might be hard to tell with this dark fabric, but you can see that it will eventually be one straight line. So I'm just going to keep matching up my edges here, working my way down, lining up those edges to make them nice and straight, and pinning my way across. Now, because we are dealing with a very skinny strip, this is the saddest looking bias binding tube that ever was. But what we're going to do next is we're just going to stitch a 1/4 inch seam all the way down. You should have a little bit hanging off at the end, and just like when we started over on the other side. And that's important. It means that we're going to be able to cut one continuous strip off once we get through the next step. I'm still being lazy, and I'm going to use my walking foot for this step. Now, normally when you do bias binding, you are dealing with a little bit more manageable tube. This one twists so much because we have that half yard, it's so skinny, that I like to cut it apart before I press it open. So it's a lot of little presses when you're done, but it's not a big deal. All right, so now we're just going to start cutting on all of those lines. Make sure you're only cutting through one layer of fabric at a time. And this is by far the most tedious part of the entire process because you do have to do it by hand, but the results are so worth it, and it ends up saving you a ton of time. Alrighty, we have yards and yards of nice stretchy binding that is going to curve around the round edges of our tree skirt perfectly. Now I'm going to just go ahead and press this in half, and as I go I'm going to open up those seams as well. All right guys, we have reached the home stretch. We're going to sew our binding to the top by machine, and then I'm going to turn it by hand, but you could always sew it by machine as well if you're in a hurry and say it's, you know, Christmas Eve and you got to gift it the next morning. So you always want to start when you're doing bias binding on a tree skirt on one of the straight edges. That way it'll be a lot easier to join your edges when everything's said and done. Just like regular binding on a quilt, we're going to leave like 6 or so inches free. I'm probably going to start right about here, and then I'm going to turn my corner and make my way around. These corners are a little bit more awkward than normal, but I just do my regular miter and work my way around. It's the top ones that are trickier because that is a really tight angle. But if you've quilted, if you've done mitered binding on a quilt before, you can do it on this for sure. All right, the only thing that's different is you are continually matching the curve of your binding to the curve of your tree skirt. It's always nice to start on that outside because it's a lot easier because it's a much more gradual curve. But that's what that bias binding is for. It will match it for you just fine. All right, I'm about to go into that inner corner. The outer ones are pretty much like a regular miter. Those aren't a big deal. This one is a weird angle because it's such a tight curve. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put that needle down and turn it. I work. Then I'm going to lift it up, and it's just not your typical miter. It's just going to come in at a different angle. Things are going to look a little funny. It's not going to be square. It's okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start stitching just a couple in place. And you can see I've got my piece going straight out here, and it's just a lot of maneuvering when you're working in this tight corner. So just take your time, don't rush it. You really are going to do a couple of stitches at a time, and then you're going to lift it up and move it. And you're just going to keep doing that, slowly working your way around. And because we took the time to do the bias edge, it's going to lay just fine when everything's said and done, as long as you cut to that right area. But it's just going nice and slow, doing a few stitches at a time, then readjusting. All right, so we're gonna do some continuous binding here. If you've never done it before, it's a little intimidating the first time you do it, but after that, it's so awesome and you can never tell where you stopped and started. All right, so I'm gonna start just by getting my ruler and laying it out. And I wanna get it so that I've got like an inch line nice and even with the edge. And I'm just gonna clip this about halfway in between where I started and stopped. And making sure that I've got a nice square edge there. All right, so now what I'm going to do, I'm going to lay my ruler so that it is nice and even with the edge of the binding that I just cut. And then I'm going to lay this piece out, and I am going to cut to a 1/4 inch less than the width of my binding. This is especially important when you're doing bias because it is really going to want to stretch on you. So I cut mine to 2.5. So I'm going to trim it at 2.25 inches beyond where that piece stopped. That's the scary part. But you know what? If you mess up, you got extra binding. You can unpick a little bit and stitch them back in. You'll be fine. All right, so with that scary part over, what we're going to do is we're going to join our binding just like we would for regular traditional binding, where we're going to put our pieces right sides together. And actually, it looks like that wasn't super straight. We're going to even that out a little bit. Perfect. All right, so I'm going to line up my corners, and I'm just going to kind of walk my edges over, and I'm going to pin, going right out into that corner. And then I'm going to also match up my corners again and work my way down. And this time I like to pin, so I'm going across where I'm going to be sewing. So now I'm going to stitch from my top corner to my bottom corner, just like I would if I was putting regular binding together. But when everything's said and done, it's going to end up as one nice strip. All right, so you got to do a little bit of finagling with your quilt here, so that way you can get your corner to lie nice and flat. Just the corner of your binding should be in the throat of your sewing machine like this. If it looks like anything else, you've done something wrong. All right, so I'm just going to slowly start stitching. It looks like my piece is getting a little caught up there. So we're going to lift her up, move her forward a little bit. That happens sometimes. All right, once I've gotten that first bit, I'm going to flatten everything out nice and stitch. And this gives me a nice guide because I know that this pin is going out to where my corner is, and I can remove it once I'm a little bit further in and just aim for that corner. All right, this part's really important. Before you cut anything apart, you want to make sure that when you put it out like that, that you don't have any gaps or where it's going to be all bunched up together. This one's good. It's going to stretch nicely across that area, so we're going to be fabulous. So now I can take and I can trim off that corner piece to give myself a 1/4 inch seam. Now this part I just finger press to the side. I don't worry about pressing it open or anything like that. Now I can start a little bit before where I stopped and end a little bit before where I started, and we'll have one big continuous piece with no lumpy bumpy part because it just looks fabulous because everything is joined on that 45-degree angle. All right guys, we've got our tree skirt. Obviously I still need to work to stitch all this down. I'm going to hand bind it. Grab my current Netflix show and just stitch that down. Probably, I'm guessing 2 episodes. I think 2-hour-long episodes, and I will be good to go. So I am exactly at 3 hours since I started filming. Obviously, we've cut this video down significantly because you don't want to see me sew for 3 hours straight. But this is definitely a project that you can do in a day. I didn't cut any of the wedges except for the 2 that you saw on camera. So plan like 4 or 5 for sewing and prep, and then maybe another hour or 2 for doing your binding. So this is definitely a good day project, a good weekend project, maybe if you're a little bit slower and you're still taking your time. But this is definitely something you can get done for this holiday season. We have lots of options. Let me grab the kits one more time for you. So we've got the peppermint that you saw me sew together here on camera, a nice, great modern collection from Figo. Looks great. I love it. We can incorporate a little bit of pink in there and these reds that aren't like true reds, but close enough. This is a fun one. And this bias binding is going to be so fun because it's going to have that nice diagonal edge going all around. Then we've got Mary and Maud, a nice, fun, modern collection again, where we have some different color greens. We got some neon green. We've got Counting Down Till Christmas. We've got a lot of fun prints there. We've got Fa La La. This one's from Free Spirit. It is fun, it is funky, it is fresh. It is just my kind of fabric for Christmas. I love it. And then of course we have some classic Christmas too. This is Holiday Classics that was put together by Rifle Paper Company. I love her aesthetic. It is so pretty and it looks so great. And this one has a metallic in it, so this one is going to be a little bit more expensive because that is a more intensive process, so the fabric just by the yard is more expensive. Lots of options, plus we have just some battings just hanging out that you can just get if you want to use what you have. We use 8 to 9 fat quarters in each of these. We still had a little bit left over after that that we can use to make scrap quilts, because there's nothing more fun than having a holiday quilt that gives you all the memories of all the holiday projects that you have made over the years. And we have a tutorial for that coming up later in our 12 Makes a Christmas. Well, thanks for following along with our first video. Everything that you've seen in today's video, you can purchase over at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. It's a great way to say thanks for us giving you some ideas for things you can make this holiday season, and for putting together the tutorials that you can watch for free anytime on our website or on YouTube. Is to get the supplies from us. We worked really hard to get all of these together for you and make them so you could actually see what they look like. And you can see photos of them on our website when you're picking out your variation that you want. And also, you know, even if you're going with your own fabric, if these are not your bag, we have some extras of just the batting. It was so fun, so easy. Like, I normally loathe doing projects where I have to do the whole thing from start to finish on camera, but this was not bad at all. It went really well, and even though we got off a little bit on the piecing, we were able to make it up and still make it work. It really was a lot of fun. So check that out. It is a Quilt-As-You-Go table runner. It is a June Tailor Quilt-As-You-Go batting product, and it was just real fun. I mean, you really don't have to iron until you're putting on your binding, and then it's just ironing to get that together. And it's just so fun. This is going to look so cute underneath the Christmas tree. It'll be fabulous. All right, well, stay tuned. We're going to have another 12 Make a Christmas coming up for you tomorrow. Until next time, happy quilting.